tonight, and I'd like to introduce fellow member and tonight's host, Charlie Bobrinskoy, who's Vice Chair and Head of the Investment Group at Ariel Investments. Now, for those of you who've been here for a while, Charlie has done an outstanding job putting this program together year after year for the past 12 years. And yes. How many have been here for all 12? There you go, you got your fan club right there, Charlie. I think we probably, how many have been here for 10 or more? See, it's growing, I'm telling you. You really got to, as a result of Charlie's courageous leadership, we've had the opportunity to discuss timely topics that elicit fascinating perspectives from our members, ranging from Plato and Aristotle to Churchill and Catherine the Great, and a whole lot more in between. So, for those of you who've been here before, perhaps you will recall that Charlie's grandfather was a member of the aristocracy in Russia, living in a 36-room home before the Communist Revolution. And then some people calling themselves followers of Karl Marx came along, and pretty soon Charlie's grandfather found himself on a boat to America with all of his possessions in a suitcase. So, as you may recall from last year, when Charlie talked about Alexander Hamilton, he called him his hero. What do you think he's going to say about it? Well, probably not the same terminology, but let's keep an open mind. So now I'm going to turn it over to Charlie, and you can give us the great tutorial that you always do. Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you. Thank you, Donna. I'm just going to open with a Washington Post, April 16, 2016 headline. A majority of millennials now reject capitalism, poll shows. In an apparent rejection of the basic principles of the U.S. economy, a new poll shows that most young people do not support capitalism. The Harvard University survey, admittedly suspect, which polled young adults between ages 18 and 29, found that 51% of respondents do not support capitalism. Just 42% said they support it. It isn't clear that young people in the poll would prefer some other alternative system, though. Just 33% said they supported socialism. The survey had a margin of error of 2.4 percentage points. So I think this is, we all agree this is timely. And I'm going to walk through sort of why it's timely in just a second. But before I do that, I want to introduce the people who make this event possible, and that is the moderators for tonight's event. These are my friends from the Henry Crown Fellowship Program, a program that was started by Lester Crown and his family at the Aspen Institute. And without these people, there's no event tonight. First, Phil Callahan from Kingsbury Partners. Phil, stand actually just quickly. Phil. Thank you. Phil Harris from Northwestern. I didn't actually see. There he is in the back. Phil. Tanya Hinch from the Aspen Institute and the Henry Crown Program. Peter Karabatsos from Abbott Labs. Peter over here. Tim Krauskopf, who's actually been at every single one of these events from Round Lake Designs. Phyllis Lockett from Leap Innovations. Phyllis, right on my right. Eric Reeves from the Joshua Group. Eric, thank you. Ryan Ruskin from the Ruskin Group, back on the right. Thank you. Pat Ryan from Incessant Labs, in the back. Pat Ryan, thank you for being here. Angela Williams from YMCA. Angela, thanks for doing this. And our pinch hitter, in case anybody didn't show, you already met Donna Zarconi from the Economics Group. Jim O'Connor from William Blair was going to get here a minute late. Has he made it here yet? All right, he's going to make it, and he'll be our last discussion group leader. So, why are we talking about Karl Marx? I'm going to argue that Karl Marx and his ideas had more impact on the 20th century than any other person. Maybe you could argue Jesus of Nazareth or Prophet Muhammad, but I think you're going to be able to make a real case that the ideas of Karl Marx had more of an impact on the 20th century than anybody else. And just to give you a little bit of a flavor, at one point, more than 25% of the world's population lived under a government that called itself Marxist. Take a look. Ominous music. So Russia goes in 1917, and Mongolia, and Yugoslavia, Korean Peninsula, Eastern Europe, China in the late 40s. Now watch Africa. Yemen in the Middle East. I think that's the Congo. That's Angola, Ethiopia, Benin, Somalia, and that's Ethiopia. Then Ronald Reagan, and Poland goes the other way. Romania goes the other way. They start falling. Russia goes in 91. Mongolia, Africa, leaving only as we speak China and Cuba. Very good, very good. These are technically Marxist, very important point, not just socialist countries. If you throw in socialist countries, you get 1 billion people in India. You get, at one point, Israel. You get lots of places in, there were obviously socialist governments in England. So you could argue more than half of the world's population has lived under countries, governments that was some tie to Karl Marx. So, all right. So, who was this man, and what did he teach? So, he was born in Trier. I should have said Prussia. Don't yell at me. It was actually Prussia, not Germany, in 1818. His father was actually Jewish and converted to Protestantism. Most people speculate to help his law practice. This actually becomes important later, and I'll talk about why. We think of Karl Marx as this bushy-bearded, scholarly fellow who wrote 800-page books on capitalism. He actually was a wild man as a youngster. He fought in a duel at age 17. He belonged to a drinking society. His father got so fed up with his wild behavior that he sent him to the strict University of Berlin, where Hegel, no party animal himself, was the head of the philosophy department. He studied philosophy, and this is important, not economics. Those of us who are not fans of Karl Marx's theories always like to point out that he never studied economics. His thesis was on Democrates and Epicurus. Epicureanism is the belief that pleasure is what life's all about. He married Jenny Westphalen in 1843, and they had 6 children, and that's kind of interesting. Remember in the Communist Manifesto, he has some pretty nasty things to say about marriage, but marriage actually lasted, and he outlived his wife. They had, by all accounts, a very happy marriage. He did have one child outside of his marriage by his nanny, who he did end up recognizing late in life. So I'm not going to say everything was perfect, but he led a very, one might say, bourgeois existence. He, in 1843, he wrote for the communist journal French Annals. And this is a very important point, because he joined communist institutions and organizations. He didn't found communism. He didn't start communism. Communism and socialism existed before him, but not much before him. There was really, nobody used the phrase communist or socialist in the year 1790. It was a 19th century phenomenon. So that's a picture of young Karl in his drinking society days. I do like to throw this out because we do have this image of him as this, I guess, professorial writer of long tracts. And as a young man, he would have seen himself more as a young revolutionary, a fighter, a man about town. All right, that takes us to a very important figure, which is Engels. And everything that you read in the Communist Manifesto is by Marx and Engels. Most of the books are by Marx and Engels. And the importance, there are two things that Engels brings to the picture. First of all, his father was a wealthy cotton industrialist. And Engels was always sending Marx money, because Marx was a lousy capitalist. He was always broke. And so Engels was constantly sending him money. The second thing that was very important was that Engels was a very good writer. Marx was clearly the brilliant thinker, the deep thinker, the one who came up with all the original ideas, but he tended to be very long-winded. If any of you have ever tried to get through Das Kapital, it's 3 volumes, 800 pages each, very heavy, slow going. Engels was the great writer. Engels was the one who came up with Workers of the World Unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains. Religion is the opium of the masses. All of those phrases are Engels. So that was the two of them formed a much better writing duo than they would have been by themselves. All right, so I mentioned this issue of Marx having had Jewish parents, and maybe as a way to, it's hard to get into his head, but why he did this is still not clear. He published an essay entitled On the Jewish Question, in which he said that the problem with Jews is not their Orthodox religion, but their tendency to exploit by lending money. He called for the emancipation of society from Judaism. I actually read this the other day just in preparation for this night's discussion. It's some pretty strong anti-Semitic stuff. And this becomes important because when Hitler and the Nazis came to power and they invaded Russia, part of their pitch was that they were trying to crush Jewish Bolshevism. And it's a little hard when you read this kind of thing to square the idea that Bolshevism or Marxism is in some way a Jewish philosophy, but there were people who made that charge over the years. In 1844, he's accused by the Prussian government of committing treason. And back in those days, you weren't actually shot usually for writing treasonous stuff. You were exiled. He was exiled from what was then Prussia for life. He was then subsequently exiled from Brussels and then from France. So he ended up spending most of his life in England. So in 1847, Marx and Engels joined the Communist League, which was an existing organization. They didn't found it. And they were chosen to write the Communist Manifesto. And that was the document that you had in your pre-read. Now, there's a couple of things to say about the Communist Manifesto. So if you talk to a serious Marx scholar, or even someone who calls himself a Marxist, today, and surprisingly there are a lot of these people working at major universities, they will tell you that they kind of look down their nose at the Communist Manifesto. They would say it's a pamphlet. At the time, revolution was in the air in 1848. Everybody thought revolutions were coming. It was a call to action, a pamphlet to incite the masses, not the serious theses, the serious document that later Marx would be. Current Marxists would point to On Surplus Value, and particularly point to Das Kapital for being more serious Marx. So current Marxists tend to kind of wave their hands at the Communist Manifesto. So again, there's a revolutionary environment in 1848. Revolutions do break out in Germany, Denmark, France, but they're pretty quickly put down. And Marx and his colleagues' dreams of a communist takeover revolution are pretty quickly squashed. And he and his family are forced to move to London. You'll notice that 18 years pass before the first volume of Das Kapital comes out. He does writing in between, but this guy, remember Hamilton put out 54 letters from the Federalist Papers in 6 months, Marx did not write like he was running out of time. Marx was a slow, methodical researcher. In 1883, he died in England, a little bit disappointed about the revolutions that had not come. He was still famous in communist circles, but not really around the world. He didn't become famous until World War I, when communism came to Russia. So let's talk a little bit, and I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit. Let's talk about his ideas. So no idea comes out of nowhere. Marx was really heavily influenced by two German philosophers. The first was Hegel. Hegel taught at the University of Berlin very shortly before Marx got there, maybe 15 years before. So Hegel was almost a contemporary of Marx, 15 years ahead of time. Hegel, first main idea is the dialectic. The dialectic is a way of thinking, a way of reasoning. You start with a thesis. There's an opposing antithesis or antithesis. The two come back and you produce a synthesis, a third idea that comes out of the first two. That's the dialectic. And it's also a way of thinking about history, of two forces that combat each other and produce a third way. So that is going to become very important in Marx's thinking. This idea that human history is the story of opposing forces and producing change, but always, and very importantly, always improving change with an ultimate goal of freedom. And history, according to Hegel, always on a path towards freedom. Even Marx himself was an optimist on this point, that history was all about more and more and more freedom. Hegel was the one who coined the phrase alienation, or at least made it important. It's not so prevalent in your readings today about Communist Manifesto. That word's not used a lot, but in subsequent writings of Karl Marx, it's everywhere. Alienation is a key idea in Marxism. It's the idea that society forces human beings to become almost inhuman. That in the workplace, specialized labor makes you do a task more and more machine-like. You become a person who just moves your arm back this way or rolls a rock this way, and you're now a cog in a machine. You're no longer human. You no longer can relate to other humans, and you have lost your own sense of your own humanity. That's the concept of alienation, which is very important to Marx. Second very important figure who actually started writing when Marx was at the University of Berlin was Feuerbach. Feuerbach came up with the idea, again, other people mentioned this idea, but it was really he who championed it, of materialism. This was the idea that how people earn their livings, how they put food on the table, how they feed for their family, that's what determines the structure of a society. That leads to the ideas that drive society, not the other way around. And the reason why this is so revolutionary is until then, philosophy was basically Platonist. Plato taught that everything is about ideas, beauty, justice, truth. And those are ideas, forms that live no matter what human beings think. And therefore, it's all about discovering those ideas. Feuerbach and then Marx said that's backwards. It's all about, first about things, and things lead to society, not the other way around. All right, so from this, I promise I'm going to get going faster here. Marx forms what's called dialectic materialism. And it's, again, history is best understood not as a clash of ideas, it's a step, things combining, the tools which people use to earn their livings, the jobs they do, that's what history is all about. So the way to think about this is if you're going to study the American Revolution, we were probably all taught that it was a struggle for freedom and democracy and representation. Marx would say it was a struggle between mercantilism and colonial self-interest. And then this concept of the superstructure, there's this base structure, which is how people earn their living, the religions, the governments that form on top, that's the superstructure that comes on top of the means of production. All right, so in your readings, I went back to my Duke Russian History Handbook and took out from David McKinsey, Professor McKinsey, the summary of the 6 phases of Marx's theory of history. I won't go through this in a lot of detail, but the concept is you start with primitive communism, where everybody hunts in groups, there are no classes, all the food is shared equally, there are no real division of labor, and then technological change produces change in structures. So learning how to domesticate animals, how to grow agricultural products means somebody's got to own the land in order to want to invest in growing the crops. And so you have property owners and then slaves who work on the land. And in every subsequent piece of history, you're going to have 2 groups, an oppressor who gets the wealth and a workers group who does the work. Every subsequent history partition, except for ultimate socialism, will have that. So then the development of the hand mill, how you could mill grain, now leads to lords and serfs, as well as a battle between slaves and slave owners. That gives you feudalism. Marx's great famous quote on this is, the hand mill gives you society with a feudal lord, the steam mill society with the industrial capitalist. The idea is that development of the steam engine made it more economical for people to move to cities and work in factories rather than the serfs who were tied to the land. And so just as we're seeing today, the urbanization of China with people moving off the farm into factories, that's what Marx said was happening throughout the world as people moved into factories, and it was because of this technological developments. And now we've got, excuse me, now we have capitalists who own the factories hiring workers, the proletariat. Now here's where I'm going to have my first blatant editorial of the evening. Bourgeois comes from the word meaning middle class. First of all, nobody has ever in the history of the world been able to spell bourgeois. Second, the word means middle class. When we think of capitalists and factory owners, don't we think of upper class? And don't we think of people who work in factories as middle class? So Marx has been confusing generations of students with this weird word choice. And I think it comes from the idea that there were the lords and the aristocracy who were the upper class, and then below them are the capitalists. But again, just a very poor construct. All right, so now under socialism, to get to socialism, you have a conflict between the workers and the capitalists. The workers are all, I'll get to this thing, the workers are all creating all the wealth, but the capitalists are keeping all the wealth. So there's an inequitable distribution of goods. And now under socialism, the communist vanguard teaches the socialists about socialism and communism. Here I need to make a very important point. The words communism, socialism, and Marxism have probably changed. And today people use those words differently. Marx would have said that those words were synonymous. He would have said that he was a socialist, a communist, and a Marxist. Lenin would have said he was a socialist, a communist, and a Marxist. Mao would have said he was a socialist, a communist, and a Marxist. Castro would have said he was a socialist, a Marxist, and a communist. Saying you were a socialist and not a communist would be like saying you believed in playing baseball for 7 innings. It's a 9-inning game. And the whole point of Marxism is that there's a scientific description of history that leads through all 6 phases. And that it's not debatable that communism is going to come around after socialism. It's scientific. That was the theory. So I'm searching for analogies on this. It would be like saying you were a socialist and not a communist would be like saying you believed in good pitching, but you didn't believe in no-hitters. Communism is the ultimate good pitching, according to Karl Marx. Now, again, I'm willing to grant that there are people today who call themselves socialist and not Marxist, not communist, but not Karl Marx. Okay, so again, we have this idea that the communist vanguard is going to teach socialists about socialism, and then we're going to reach the perfect state of communism, of socialism, excuse me, which is communism. The workers' state, the government, which is controlled by the workers, will wither away. Try to keep the disdain in my voice hidden here, Charlie. The state will wither away, just by its, like dead leaves on a branch. He uses that exact phrase. And property, private property, class struggle, and exploitation will disappear. And we get the famous line, from each according to their abilities, to each according to his needs. In other words, if you're a great doctor, you will provide healthcare services, and then you will be paid by what you need, not based on the economic value of what you've produced. That phrase, again, probably attributable to Engels, not Marx. All right, so Marx, probably in this room, I'm going to guess we don't have a lot of people that really believe in communism. Maybe some we do, we'll see at dinner. But the question is, was Marx a good critic of capitalism? Most Marxists today would say he didn't spend much time worrying about communism, he didn't write much about it, he spent a lot of time analyzing and criticizing capitalism. And so, as a believer in dialectic, this idea of forces coming in contact with each other, he was looking for contradictions in capitalism. That's what he thought produced change. And the big three contradictions in capitalism probably are going to sound pretty familiar to all of us in this room. First is that capitalists are always competing with each other to improve profits, so they're always going to try to cut the salaries of their workers. The workers are going to have less money to buy the capitalist products. That's a contradiction and a problem. The next one is that capitalists are going to try and cut costs by sending the work overseas to try to get cheaper work and to open up new markets. And that local workers will lose their jobs and they won't have the money to buy capitalist products. Marx did write this in 1852. And then capitalists want to cut costs by introducing technology. Technology reduced the number of workers who cannot buy the products. Contradiction. Marx did write this in the 1850s. So we're going to talk at dinner. These are usually considered Marx's three fundamental contradictions in capitalism that will ultimately cause capitalism's demise. We're going to talk at dinner which of these looks like it's coming true. It's been 170 years. Capitalism hasn't really imploded yet. What do we think? So, this is just one more very important, sorry, I keep quoting Marxists, but if you ask a modern Marxist, what were Marx's two most important ideas? They are first, this idea of the dialectic material theory of history, that history is about things, working, food, economics, not ideas. That's number one. And the second one is this idea of surplus value. The concept is that when an employer decides to hire someone, he only does that, he or she only does that, if they think that worker is going to produce goods that can be sold for more than the wages paid to the worker. That's the only reason why an employer hires a worker. So Apple pays the workers who make iPhones only $100. They sell the phones for $700. The workers created the iPhone, and so the capitalist is stealing the surplus value. When Henry Ford paid workers, but Ford Motor Company today pays workers $10,000 for every car. The workers create the car, they sell the car for $20,000. The capitalists are keeping the surplus value. He didn't actually use the word steal, he used expropriation. Marx could never use a simple word when a longer one would suffice. And this really was their core thesis as to why capitalism would ultimately fail, because the workers would get onto this and realize they were creating all the value and that the capitalists were stealing it from them. Now, once again, I will show my cards and say, to me, it's just how can you say that the entrepreneur adds no value? How can you say that Steve Jobs adds no value to the iPhone? Or that an entrepreneur adds no value, that John Pierpont Morgan added no value to Morgan Bank? I find this preposterous, but it is the second of the two core ideas of Marxism. And what was supposed to happen is workers of the world unite. You've got nothing to lose but your chains. Again, probably written by Engels. Okay, so this is my list of David Letterman's top 10 Marx criticisms of capitalism. I'm not going to go through them 10 through 1, but I'm just going to put them all up. I've covered most of them. They're on your tables in summary form. The first I've already mentioned, alienation. Capitalism makes man into a machine. He loses his humanity. Insecurity. Workers can be fired at a moment's notice. Nobody likes to think that they're disposable. We already talked about the competitive wage reductions, how capitalism, the phrase he used was, dug its own grave. The capitalists dig their own grave by cutting the wages of its workers. Globalization, technology, we've already talked about. Excessive abundance. I got to give Marx credit on this one. He said that one of the core problems of capitalism was it was so efficient, so productive, that it would produce way more goods than we need. And when that would happen, you'd get a massive recession, as there was not enough demand for all the products. And these recessions would get bigger and bigger over time. Marx wrote that in the first volume of Das Kapital. I like this one too. You all saw it in the Communist Manifesto, the demeaning of professions. Every occupation, like being a doctor, being a lawyer, is taken from its nobility and becomes simply selling your wages. You're no longer, even a priest is just for hire. You read the comments about marriage. And we can all think what we want about that, but in early stages in Soviet Russia, they believed in communal relationships. A lot of communes in the US didn't believe in marriage, believed in sharing women. I'm just going to drop that right there. All right. And then the last one is the obvious one, expropriation of value, that workers create all the value, but capitalists steal it, and that's what surplus value is. So your job tonight is to talk about these 4 questions, and your moderators have a lot of allowance. They can do whatever they want. We thought these would be good conversation starters. Which of Marx's criticisms of capitalism do you find compelling? Where was Marx most wrong about capitalism? And another way to put that is he predicted that capitalism was going to implode soon in 1848. Here we are in 2017, and it hasn't. And in fact, a very other interesting point is the places that communism came were mostly not capitalist countries going communist, as he predicted, but agrarian countries or feudal countries like Russia and China. So capitalism has rarely, think about counterexamples tonight if you can, but communism has rarely come out of capitalism. So most Marxist countries didn't work out so well. Was there a fatal flaw in Marx's thinking that led to the collapse of communism, or are we just in communism 1.0 and 2.0 will be better? And then this was Professor Wolf's question. You saw him in the YouTube video. And he's a self-described Marxist, and he asks this question. He says, every other system has been born, developed, and ended. Why should capitalism be any different? Are we really so cocky as to think we've stumbled on the perfect, eternal system? Interesting question. All right, so I tried to give that a fair, balanced presentation. Your job now is to go fill this out. I think this is timely. Socialism is more popular today than it's been at any time in the United States since the 1930s. 20 years ago, any politician saying they were socialist would have been laughed out of office. And clearly Bernie Sanders wasn't.